A black tide swallowed the final marker on the stone wharf of Westerdam. A brass slide rule clicked shut in a pair of trembling, frost-bitten hands. The disgraced engineer calculated that everyone in the city would drown in exactly 42 days. A heavy wooden gavel slammed down onto a polished oak desk. Armed guards drew their steel swords in the dry municipal hall. The engineer fled into the dark, rain-slicked alleys of the low-town slums. Hendrik Meer stood at the very edge of the lower harbor. Cold rain dripped from the frayed brim of his leather cap. The North Sea churned against the ancient stone wall below his boots. He held a tarnished brass slide rule against his palm. His fingers shook as he aligned the logarithmic scales. A pale blue light flickered across his pupils. Glowing geometric overlays projected directly onto his field of vision. The calculus of flow mapped the swirling currents in bright mathematical vectors. A sharp stabbing pain flared behind his left temple. He squeezed his eyes shut to stop the throbbing ache. When he opened them, a tiny red capillary had ruptured. A bead of warm blood rolled down his cheek. The disgraced engineer wiped the crimson droplet with his sleeve. He looked at the dark smear on his damp cuff. The red stain stood out against the gray fabric. He knew his time was running out. I need to build the cofferdam, but the guild owns every scrap of oak. He turned away from the rising tide. His boots splashed through the shallow puddles of the low-town alleys. The scent of rotting fish and wet coal filled the stagnant air. He needed high-density timber and hydraulic lime to hold back the sea. The Mason Guild controlled the warehouses along the eastern docks. Grand Mason Rude Kroon kept those yards under lock and key. Hendrik walked deeper into the labyrinth of the canal district. The buildings leaned toward each other like tired old men. Green moss coated the rotting foundations of the tenements. A cold wind blew off the harbor, carrying the taste of salt. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders. The street lamps were unlit, leaving the alley in deep shadow. He stepped over a pile of discarded cutter. When he opened them, the pain behind his left temple had sharpened into a hot needle. He looked up at the high stone cliffs overlooking the western inlet. A black carriage with polished silver trim sat near the cliff's edge. Willem de Graaf stood beside the carriage, wrapped in a heavy coat of black fox fur. The corrupt burgomaster held a long brass spyglass to his right eye. He stared down at the muddy flats with a cold, calculating expression. He watched the low-town laborers drive the illegal timber into the municipal mud. He knew that a successful bypass channel would divert the floodwaters away from his toll dikes. If the Lowtown remained dry, his lucrative emergency taxes would vanish overnight. The wealthy politician lowered his spyglass and whispered an order to his driver. The carriage doors slammed shut, and the horses trotted back toward the Hightown gates. Hendrik watched the carriage disappear before returning his attention to the water. The tide was rising faster now, the waves lapping at the base of the first piling. The blue vectors on his vision turned a thick gray fog rolled across the western inlet of Westerdam. Cold water lapped against the freshly driven pine pilings of the bypass channel. Hendrik Meer leaned over the wooden railing of the primary sluice gate. His left eye was bloodshot, a dark red ring encircling his pale pupil. The skin beneath his cheekbones looked hollow and gray from sleepless nights. He held his tarnished brass slide rule close to his chest. The metal felt cold and damp against his calloused skin. A low rhythmic thud echoed from the stone causeway above the mudflats. Hendrik looked up toward the Hightown road. 12 heavily armored figures marched through the swirling mist in perfect unison. They wore the deep green wool and iron breastplates of the Mason Guild. Heavy iron crowbars and massive wooden sledges swung from their leather belts. At the front of the column marched Grand Mason Rude Kroon. His thick shoulders were draped in a heavy mud-stained leather mantle. He carried an iron-banded stone mallet that dragged slightly along the wet gravel. His face was set in hot iron rod driving through his skull. A second capillary ruptured in his right eye, clouding his vision with red. He ignored the blood dripping onto his lip. He focused entirely on the central keyway measurements of the ancient piles. He memorized the exact depth of the primary Roman foundation stones, 24 meters below the mud, anchored into the solid granite bedrock. The blue vectors locked the coordinates into his memory. The water rose to his knees, cold and relentless. The ancient parchment was now completely saturated with muddy water. The delicate drawings of the culverts dissolved into meaningless gray smudges. The map was gone, destroyed by the very element it was designed to control. Section 7. The Escape, expanding the action. The oil lantern slipped from Hendrik's numb, wet fingers. It splashed into the rising water, extinguishing the light with a sharp hiss. The room plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the dying candle. Martin Brand stumbled in the deep water, losing his footing on the art. A cold rain dripped from the brim of Hendrik's leather hat. The water pooled in the deep ruts of the northern clay pits. A thick, greasy layer of blue clay coated his worn boots. The heavy soil clung to his heels with every step he took. He looked down into the massive, excavated trench before him. The northern pits stretched out like a raw, open wound in the gray earth. This was the only source of impermeable blue clay in the entire delta. He needed 10 tons of this dense material to seal the core of his dam. Without it, the high tides would wash away his sandy foundations in minutes. He pulled his brass slide rule from his damp pocket. The metal felt freezing against his raw, calloused palm. He squeezed his eyes shut as a sharp throb flared behind his left temple. When he opened them, the blue light of the calculus of flow flickered to life. Glowing geometric lines projected directly over the muddy trenches. Bright mathematical vectors mapped the density of the subterranean soil layers. The blue clay glowed with a deep, solid grid of high density. A dark purple line stretched across the western horizon of the North Sea. The wind carried the sharp, metallic smell of ozone and rotting kelp. The first heavy raindrops dimpled the smooth surface of the rising canal. Hendrik van der Meer stood on the muddy embankment of the western inlet. His boots sank 3 inches into the cold, gray clay. He pulled his wool collar up to protect his throat from the rising gale. A dozen Lowtown laborers worked frantically along the canal bed below him. They shoveled the last mounds of blue clay into the timber-reinforced banks. The spade blades made a wet, sucking sound with every lift. Hendrik looked down at his brass slide rule, his fingers stiff from the cold. The tarnished metal was covered in a fine mist of salt spray. His left eyelid twitched, a dull throb pulsing behind his temple. The previous week's calculations had left a dark, bruise-like shadow beneath his eyes. The tide is rising too fast for a normal autumn storm. He looked out toward the barrier islands 3 miles away. The white foam of the breakers was visible, even through the driving rain. Hendrik pulled his gaze from the churning sea. His eyes settled on the eastern retaining wall of the diversion canal. Water poured over the timber-reinforced banks. The newly laid blue clay held firm against the surging current. But a section of the eastern wall sagged visible. A jagged crack split the fresh concrete facing near its base. The crack widened with each rhythmic impact of the waves. Hendrik's jaw tightened. He gripped his brass slide rule. A searing pain bloomed behind his eyes. The blue glow of the calculus of flow erupted across his vision. Geometric lines overlaid the damaged wall. They mapped the internal structure of the concrete. Fracture vectors pulsed in an angry red. The stone itself was weak. It possessed a crystalline flaw running through its entire mass. This was not a construction error. This was deliberate. He traced the origin point of the flaw. The vectors led back to the quarry stamp. The stamp belonged to the de Graaf Holding Company. Willem de Graaf owned the quarry. But the granite had been delivered by a specific fleet. The fleet belonged to Anika Vos. A cold dread washed over him. His hands trembled slightly on the slide rule. She supplied the fractured granite. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He felt a sharp metallic taste on his tongue. His left eye throbbed with renewed intensity. He wiped a thin trickle of blood from his cheek. The storm intensified around him. He needed to confront her. Hendrik moved through the battered harbor district. Broken crates and splintered planks drifted in the swollen canals. The wind howled through empty warehouses. Guild patrols were sparse, huddled against the driving rain. Their green cloaks were dark with moisture. He kept to the shadowed alleyways. The scent of stale fish and brine filled the air. His boots sloshed through puddles. He saw a familiar silhouette near the old timber wharf. Anika Vos stood beneath the sagging canvas awning of her hidden warehouse. Her back was to him. She watched her last remaining barge. It strained against its mooring lines. The barge was loaded with salvaged lumber. Her shoulders were hunched against the cold. Her long, dark hair was matted with rain. Hendrik approached slowly. His footsteps were muffled by the storm. He stopped a few paces behind her. Anika. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. She flinched, turning sharply. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held a flicker of fear. She clutched a heavy coil of rope to her chest. Her knuckles were white. A faint tremor ran through her body. She tried to compose herself. A forced calm settled on her features. "Hendrik," she said, her voice strained, "I did not expect you." She avoided his gaze. Her eyes darted nervously toward the dark waters of the canal. Her mouth was a thin, hard line. Her hand tightened on the rope. It was a defensive gesture. Hendrik stepped closer. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead. He held up a small, jagged piece of granite. It was flecked with bright, sparkling mica. "This stone came from your last shipment," he stated. His voice was low, unwavering. Anika's eyes widened slightly. She recognized the distinctive pattern. "It was fractured from the quarry," he continued. "Deliberately." He watched her face. Her gaze dropped to the ground. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. "The eastern wall failed," Hendrik explained. He described the hydrostatic shear. He detailed the crumbling concrete. He spoke of the lives that would be lost. Anika's breath hitched. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She looked up, her eyes pleading. "Willem de Graaf threatened my fleet," she whispered. "He would have seized everything." She explained the burgomaster's demands. He had threatened her family. He had promised to bankrupt her. She had no choice. Hendrik activated his calculus of flow. Blue lines overlaid Anika. He saw her financial ledger projected in the air beside her. Her assets were tied to her ships. Her debts were significant. The burgomaster's leverage was immense. Her survival instincts were strong. Her fleet was her life's work. He saw the fear in her eyes. He saw the desperation. He saw the cold calculation of a survivor. Her hands clenched and unclenched around the rope. A visible tremor ran down her arm. The rain dripped steadily from the awning. It created a rhythmic drumming sound. He understood her predicament. He did not excuse it. "The dam will fail without proper materials," Hendrik said. His voice remained steady. "The harbor will drown." He watched her swallow hard. Her throat bobbed visibly. She knew the truth of his words. The water level in the canal behind them continued to rise. It lapped higher against the dock. She understood the stakes. Her eyes were bleak. She faced an impossible choice. Hendrik lowered his hand. He let the fractured granite fall from his fingers. It splashed into a puddle. "We need high-grade volcanic ash," he announced. Anika frowned. Her brow furrowed in confusion. "For hydraulic concrete," Hendrik clarified. "It binds stronger than any lime." He explained the properties of the ash. It created a waterproof, rapid-setting mix. It was the only way to repair the eastern wall. It was the only way to finish the dam. Anika's expression darkened. "The guild controls the ash," she stated. "It is in their secure vaults." She spoke of Rude Kroon's paranoia. The guild hoarded all valuable materials. Their vaults were heavily guarded. They were built with thick stone walls. Hendrik nodded. He knew the risks. "We steal it," he said simply. Anika stared at him. Her mouth hung slightly open. Disbelief warred with a grim understanding. "The alternative," Hendrik continued, "is simple." He gestured toward the churning harbor. "The next tide will submerge this entire district." He spoke of the 42-day countdown. He spoke of the rising sea. He spoke of the utter destruction. Her eyes scanned the horizon. The dark purple storm clouds gathered. She imagined the water rising above the rooftops. She imagined her fleet trapped, broken, useless. The harbor would be a graveyard. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked back at Hendrik. His face was grim. His eyes, though bloodshot, held an unwavering resolve. He offered no comfort. He offered only facts. He offered a desperate, dangerous path. Her mind raced. She weighed the burgomaster's threats. She weighed the guild's wrath. She weighed the absolute certainty of the deluge. The choice was stark. It was survival or oblivion. A muscle twitched in her jaw. She ran a hand through her wet hair. She was a smuggler. She understood risks. She understood impossible odds. She understood betrayal. She understood a desperate gamble. Anika finally met his gaze. Her eyes were hard, resolute. "What is your plan?" she asked. Her voice was low, hoarse. It was not a question of willingness. It was a demand for competence. Hendrik outlined his strategy. He spoke of the guild vaults. They were located beneath the Hightown Market. Their entrance was disguised. He described the patrol routes. He had observed them for weeks. He spoke of the structural vibrations. His calculus could track every guard. They would need the cover of darkness. They would need the cover of fog. Anika listened intently. Her expression remained unreadable. She considered each detail. She considered each weakness. A thick white blanket of coastal fog rolled through the cobblestone streets of Westerdam. The damp air smelled of salt, rotting kelp, and wet horse manure. Anika Voss pulled her dark woolen cloak tighter around her shoulders. She stepped over a puddle of brackish water that reflected the dim orange glow of a distant street lamp. Beside her, Hendrik van der Meer adjusted the heavy leather strap of his satchel. His left eye was still bloodshot, a crimson reminder of his last desperate calculation. He looked up at the Hightown Market Square. The grand stone arches of the Mason Guild Hall loomed through the gray mist like giant rib bones. Two guards stood by the heavy iron gates, their halberds resting against their shoulders. The men blew warm breath into their leather gloves to fight the midnight chill. Anika slipped into the shadow of a closed vegetable stall. She pointed a gloved finger toward a low iron grate near the base of the guild hall wall. The iron bars were rusted orange from decades of salty air. Hendrik crouched beside her, his boots sinking slightly into the wet mud. He crowed. Willem stood behind his bench, his hands shaking as he gripped the carved wood. His expensive fur cloak slipped from his shoulders, falling into the pool of spilled ink. He demanded that Hendrik stop the destruction of his courtroom. Hendrik replied that the physical forces of the ocean could not be arrested by a magistrate's decree. He offered to show them the safe path of escape on one condition. He demanded the immediate signing of a municipal charter granting him full control of the Western Delta. Willem's eyes bulged with fury, his jowls shaking with desperate rage. He refused to yield his authority to a disgraced outlaw. The floor groaned louder, tilting 3 degrees to the left. A heavy stone block fell from the vaulted ceiling, smashing a wooden table to splinters. The crowd shrieked and rushed the doors, completely overwhelming the guards. The iron gates creaked under the weight of the desperate mob. Hendrik watched the countdown hit 30 seconds. He braced his legs and prepared for the impact. This is the moment. The central keyway stone beneath the floor shattered into 1,000 jagged fragments of gray limestone. A deafening crack echoed through the high-vaulted courtroom as the entire eastern foundation sheared away. Dust and powdered mortar exploded upward in a choking white cloud. Heavy oak benches slid down the steep incline, splintering against the stone walls. Willem de Graaf clung to the carved wooden armrests of his elevated magistrate chair. His expensive fur cloak dipped into the rising pool of black water below. The floorboards groaned as the iron support brackets snapped with sharp metallic rings. Hendrik Meer balanced on a narrow stone ledge near the western exit. His left eye burned with an intense, white-hot heat as his power activated. Glowing blue geometric grids projected themselves onto the swirling chaos of the canal. The hydrostatic pressure is concentrated entirely on the central pier. A ruptured capillary in his left eye burst, sending a thin trickle of blood down his cheek. He saw the stress vectors shifting rapidly toward the remaining wooden columns. The water below was a violent vortex of gray foam, broken timber, and floating papers. 3 municipal councillors plunged headfirst into the freezing, brackish. The wet parchment of the municipal charter stuck to Hendrik's cold fingers. A thick drop of rain smeared the dark ink of Willem de Graaf's signature. Hendrik folded the document and stuffed it deep inside his leather coat. He looked out over the wide, gray expanse of the western delta. The incoming tide washed over the rotting wooden stakes of the old dikes. Beside him, a heavy wooden barge bumped against the temporary timber dock. Anika Voss stood on the wet deck, her hands resting on the hilt of her cutlass. She kicked a bulging sack of gray powder with the toe of her boot. A small cloud of fine, dark dust escaped the coarse burlap weave. The sharp, sulfuric smell of volcanic ash drifted across the muddy bank. Hendrik reached down and scooped a handful of the dry powder. The volcanic ash felt warm and slightly gritty against his calloused skin. He knew this ancient dust was the key to building underwater. Without it, the river currents would wash the wet lime away before it could cure. Anika spat into the brown water of the canal. She warned him that the Mason Guild was already gathering on the eastern ridge. Hendrik turned his gaze toward the rocky cliffs overlooking the delta. A dozen figures in heavy stone-colored robes stood silhouetted against the gray sky. At their center stood Rude Kroon, his massive arms crossed over his chest. The Grand Mason wore a thick leather apron stained with dried clay and mortar. He stared down at the construction site with cold, calculating eyes. Hendrik ignored the hostile gaze and waved his hand to the waiting laborers. 30 men from the low-town slums stepped forward with heavy iron shovels. They carried thick pine planks to construct the massive pouring frames. A tall laborer drove an iron-tipped pile into the soft mud of the riverbed. The heavy wooden mallet struck the timber with a dull, echoing thud. Hendrik adjusted his brass slide rule, his fingers cold and stiff. He needed the first foundation block to sit precisely on the stable clay layer. He closed his right eye and let his power flood his vision. Glowing blue geometric grids projected themselves onto the murky water. Bright cyan vectors mapped the speed and direction of the river current. The water pressure against the wooden frames was rising by 3% every minute. A sharp stabbing pain flared behind his left temple. He ignored the warning sign and forced the calculations to complete. The silt is shifting too fast. He blinked and the blue overlays vanished, leaving his left eye watery and bloodshot. He ordered the men to begin mixing the volcanic ash with the slaked lime. 4 laborers shoveled the gray dust into a massive iron-rimmed trough. 2 more men poured buckets of fresh well water over the dry mixture. A thick, white steam hissed upward as the lime reacted with the water. The heat from the chemical reaction warmed Hendrik's face as he stepped closer. The laborers stirred the thick, gray slurry with long wooden paddles. The mixture turned into a dense, sticky paste that smelled of burnt stone. Hendrik ordered them to add the coarse river gravel to the mix. The gravel would give the concrete structural strength against the heavy tides. On the eastern ridge, Rude Kroon took a step toward the edge of the cliff. The Grand Mason knelt and pressed his bare palms against the wet earth. A low, vibrating hum echoed through the rocky ground. The puddles of water along the riverbank began to ripple in concentric circles. Hendrik felt the vibrations through the soles of his leather boots. He looked down at the wooden pouring frames in the riverbed. The water around the pine planks was beginning to bubble and churn. The Grand Mason was using his earthen attunement to agitate the subsurface soil. He was trying to turn the stable clay layer into a fluid-shifting quicksand. If the soil liquefied, the massive concrete blocks would sink and tilt. The entire foundation would slide into the deep channel of the river. Anika drew her cutlass, her eyes fixed on the ridge. She offered to take 3 of her men and silence the Grand Mason. Hendrik held up his hand, stopping her. He stated that violence would only give the municipal guards an excuse to intervene. He had to defeat the guild with physics, not steel. He walked to the edge of the wooden platform, his boots splashing in the cold mud. He activated his calculus of flow once again. The blue geometric grids returned, brighter and more intense than before. The glowing lines mapped the vibration frequencies traveling through the soil. The earth magic was sending rhythmic shockwaves at 35 Hz through the silt. This specific frequency was breaking the friction between the sand grains. The riverbed was actively turning into a liquid soup. A thin trickle of blood began to seep from the corner of his left eye. The intense neurological strain felt like a hot needle sliding into his brain. He gritted his teeth and held the calculation in his mind. I must alter the concrete density to match the fluid weight of the shifting silt. He shouted to the laborers to double the amount of volcanic ash in the next batch. He ordered them to reduce the water content by 15%. The men hesitated, staring at the thick, dry paste in the troughs. The heavy mixture would be incredibly difficult to pour down the wooden chutes. Hendrik grabbed a wooden paddle himself and began to push the dense concrete. His muscles burned as he forced the heavy gray mass toward the edge. The laborers, seeing their leader work, redoubled their efforts. They dumped the thick, heavy concrete down the wide timber chutes. The dense gray slurry slid slowly, plopping heavily into the water inside the frames. Because of its high density, the concrete did not dissolve in the turning river. It sank directly to the bottom, displacing the lighter, liquefied silt. The heavy concrete compressed the shifting sand beneath it, dampening the vibrations. On the ridge, Rude Kroon's face twisted with exertion. The Grand Mason pressed his hands deeper into the mud, his veins bulging. The low hum grew louder, shaking the wooden platforms. A massive wave of muddy water erupted from the center of the riverbed. The wooden frames groaned under the sudden lateral hydrostatic pressure. One of the thick pine planks cracked with a sharp splintering sound. Water began to seep through the fracture, threatening to wash the concrete away. Hendrik ran along the slippery timber walkway toward the damaged frame. He could see the blue stress vectors concentrating entirely on the cracked plank. The structural integrity will fail in 40 seconds. He grabbed a heavy iron plate from the barge deck. He slid the metal sheet down the inside of the wooden frame, blocking the crack. The cold water splashed over his hands, numbing his fingers instantly. He held the iron plate in place with his shoulder, bracing against the current. He screamed for the men to pour the quick-setting batch directly behind the plate. The laborers tipped a massive trough of the hot, steaming concrete. The thick gray paste poured over the iron plate, sealing the leak. The volcanic ash reacted instantly with the seawater, beginning to harden. Hendrik felt the pressure against his shoulder ease as the concrete solidified. He stepped back, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. His left eye was completely bloodshot, his vision blurred by a red haze. He wiped the blood from his cheek with the back of his wet sleeve. He looked across the river toward the eastern ridge. Rude Kroon had fallen to one knee, his hands trembling as he pulled them from the mud. The Grand Mason's earth magic had exhausted his physical reserves. He could not compete with the continuous chemical hardening of the concrete. The riverbed beneath the foundation blocks was silent once again. The heavy concrete had settled into a solid, immovable mass. It locked the wooden frames to the bedrock deep beneath the silt. The first foundation stone of the Great Westerdam Dam was officially set. Anika sheathed her cutlass and let out a low, appreciative whistle. She remarked that the Grand Mason looked like he had just swallowed a bucket of silt. Hendrik did not smile. He knew this was only the first of 50 massive blocks they needed to pour. His head pounded with a vicious, blinding migraine. He looked at his hands, which were shaking from the severe metabolic strain. He knew his body could not take many more of these intense calculations. But the ocean was still rising, and the 42-day countdown was ticking. He picked up his slide rule and prepared for the next pour. The massive sluice gates stood unfinished. Their heavy timber beams rose high above the river. Hendrik surveyed the raw wood, his brow furrowed. He knew the spring tide would bring unprecedented force. His calculus of flow had already predicted the impact. The geometric overlays shimmered across his vision. They showed the kinetic energy of a coming mountain. The sheer hydrostatic pressure would shatter Meer wood. He needed high-tensile iron reinforcement bars. These bars would anchor the gates to the bedrock. Without them, the entire dam would fail. He turned to Anika, who stood nearby. She sharpened her cutlass with a practiced hand. He stated the immediate need for wrought iron. Anika nodded, her expression grim. She knew the ironmaster, Joris, was loyal to de Graaf. Retrieving the materials would prove difficult. Hendrik gripped his slide rule, his jaw tight. He knew the price of refusal would be catastrophic. They rode towards the foundry in a small cart. The air grew thick with the smell of coal smoke. The distant clang of hammers echoed through the morning mist. Soon, the foundry buildings appeared on the horizon. Black plumes of smoke billowed from tall brick chimneys. A rhythmic thudding sound vibrated through the ground. They dismounted near the main forge entrance. Heat radiated from the open doorways. The air shimmered above the red-hot metal. Joris, the ironmaster, emerged from the smoky interior. He was a burly man, his face streaked with soot. His leather apron bore the marks of countless sparks. He crossed his arms, his eyes narrowed at Hendrik. Joris was known for his unwavering loyalty to the burgomaster. He valued tradition and despised Hendrik's new methods. Hendrik stated his request for the high tensile bars. He explained their critical purpose for the sluice gates. Joris snorted, a cloud of dust escaping his nostrils. He refused the order with a curt shake of his head. He declared that he would never aid a traitor. Anika stepped forward, her hand resting on her cutlass. She spoke of the coming tide and Westerdam's fate. Joris merely scoffed at her words. He pointed a thick finger towards a nearby structure. The water wheel assembly churned sluggishly. Steam hissed from a cracked pipe near the furnace. The massive iron furnace glowed with an unhealthy intensity. Joris stated his own problem. He explained the chronic overheating of his cooling system. He described the frequent pipe bursts and steam leaks. The current output was barely half of its capacity. He challenged Hendrik to solve the issue. He said if Hendrik could fix it in 3 hours, he would supply the iron. Hendrik studied the water wheels, his mind already working. His eyes scanned the network of pipes and conduits. He activated his calculus of flow. Blue geometric lines instantly superimposed themselves. They mapped the water pressure and heat transfer. The air around the pipes pulsed with thermal vectors. He saw the turbulent flow inside the main intake. A critical bottleneck appeared in the primary manifold. The pipe diameter was too narrow for the furnace's heat output. The cooling water was boiling before it reached the main coils. His left eye began to throb with intense pain. A thin trickle of blood appeared at the corner of his eye. The entire system was designed for half this output. The pressure on his brain felt like a tightening band. He ignored the pain, focusing on the shimmering projections. He saw the precise location of the thermal choke point. He also saw the weak points in the pipe welds. The existing pumps struggled against the back pressure. He closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing moment. He then opened them, his vision slightly blurred. He turned to Joris, his voice steady. He outlined the necessary changes in precise detail. He required larger diameter pipes for the intake. He needed a second, smaller pump for the secondary circuit. He also needed to reroute a portion of the flow. Joris listened, his skepticism slowly giving way. He had heard similar solutions before, all of them failures. But Hendrik spoke with absolute cold certainty. The ironmaster summoned his own foundry workers. They were burly men, accustomed to heavy labor. They looked at Hendrik with distrust. Hendrik began to direct them with sharp commands. He pointed to specific sections of pipe. He indicated where the new connections should be made. The workers hesitated, looking to Joris for confirmation. Joris gave a reluctant nod, his face unreadable. The men began to move, slowly at first. They hauled heavy sections of iron pipe. They gathered tools from cluttered workbenches. Hendrik's head pounded with each passing minute. His left eye felt like a burning coal in its socket. He saw the structural integrity of the furnace cooling. The blue lines flickered, showing dangerous heat spikes. He urged the workers to move faster. He showed them the exact angles for the new conduits. He calculated the required flow rates in real time. The workers began to trust his precise instructions. They saw the logic in his geometric overlays. The new intake pipe was hoisted into place. Sparks flew as 2 men welded a new junction. Hendrik watched the heat dissipation vectors change. The thermal bottleneck began to ease. The secondary pump was installed near the river intake. Its new rhythmic hum joined the foundry's din. Water surged through the larger pipes. The steam around the furnace coils lessened. Joris stood silently, observing the gauges. The temperature reading slowly dropped. The red glow of the furnace softened to orange. The water wheels turned with renewed vigor. The cooling system hummed with a healthy, steady flow. The 3-hour deadline passed without a word. Joris finally broke his silence. He stated that the system now worked better than ever. He clapped Hendrik on the shoulder, a heavy hand. He promised the high-tensile iron bars would be ready. Hendrik felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. His knees almost buckled beneath his weight. The migraine was a searing pain behind his eyes. His left eye was now completely bloodshot. His vision in that eye was a blurry red haze. He wiped more blood from his cheek. He had secured the vital materials. The cost had been immense. He knew his body could not sustain many more such efforts. But the springtide was still coming. The 42-day countdown continued to tick. He picked up his slide rule from a dusty bench. He prepared for the next phase of construction. The dam still needed its final reinforcements. The fate of Westerdam rested on his calculations. He walked out of the foundry, leaving the heat behind. Anika waited for him, her expression concerned. She saw the blood on his face. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant dam. The iron bars would soon arrive. The sluice gates would stand firm. The cold morning wind swept across the unfinished crest of the western dam. Hendrik Meer walked slowly along the raw, gray concrete wall. His boots left wet prints on the damp surface of the curing stone. The massive structure curved slightly against the weight of the river. The high tensile iron reinforcement bars protruded from the concrete like skeletal fingers. They held the massive blocks firmly to the ancient bedrock of the delta. The disgraced hydraulic engineer stopped to touch the cold metal of a support bolt. His fingers traced the rough threads of the iron bar. The iron was still warm from the morning sun. He pulled his heavy brass slide rule from his leather coat pocket. The metal instrument felt cold and solid against his calloused palm. He held it up to align with the horizon line of the river. The water level sat 3 inches below the temporary wooden cofferdams. The current flowed smoothly, a dark green ribbon cutting through the mudflats. His left eye throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache behind the socket. The sclera was a map of broken red capillaries from his previous efforts. Thick gray smoke rose from the flooded avenues of the Hightown Merchant District. Muddy water lapped against the gilded doorframes of the wealthy estates. A floating carriage drifted aimlessly down a canal that used to be a cobblestone street. Hendrik Meer stood on the high concrete crest of the unfinished western dam. His boots gripped the cold, damp edge of the newly poured concrete. The freezing wind from the North Sea whipped through his tattered wool coat. His left eye throbbed with a rhythmic, burning pressure. A thin streak of dried blood stained his pale temple. He held his heavy brass slide rule in his right hand. The metal instrument caught the dim, fading light of the afternoon sky. Below him, the diverted river swirled with aggressive force. The yellow floodwaters carried broken furniture and shattered wooden crates from the rich quarter. He had ordered the sluice gates open to save the low-town slums. The cost of that decision now floated directly toward his unfinished masterwork. A distant murmur of angry voices drifted over the rushing sound of the river. Hendrik turned his gaze toward the avalanche. Willem de Graaf gripped his reins tightly, his face pale with sudden shock. Ruud Kroon stared at the collapsed path with wide, disbelieving eyes. The path to the inlet was completely severed by a wall of raw earth. The Lowtown laborers let out a loud, ringing cheer from the mudflats. They saw the hand of a master engineer in the sudden perfect slide. They turned back to the iron frame with renewed energy. Hendrik wiped the fresh blood from his lip with a shaking hand. His vision was a chaotic swirl of flashing blue lights and dark shadows. He could feel his cognitive reserve draining away like water from a broken cup. He ordered the men to begin pouring the concrete into the iron keyway. The workers wheeled heavy barrows of gray volcanic ash cement to the edge. They tipped the thick, wet mixture into the wooden forms surrounding the iron frame. The concrete slid down, filling the gaps between the high-tensile iron bars. Hendrik watched the liquid stone slowly rise around the rain, lashed against the leaded glass windows of the cluttered workshop. A heavy brass clock on the wooden mantel ticked with a slow, relentless rhythm. The copper pendulum swung back and forth, counting down the remaining 72 hours. Hendrik Meer leaned over a massive oak drafting table. His trembling fingers gripped the cold edges of his brass slide rule. A single tallow candle flickered on the corner of the desk, casting long, dancing shadows. The yellow light illuminated dozens of crumpled parchment sheets scattered across the floorboards. Each rejected paper contained scribbled calculations of hydrostatic shear and concrete load capacities. He dragged the brass runner of the rule across the worn logarithmic scales. "I must find the exact resonance frequency before the sea rises." His left eye throbbed with a dull, sickening heat behind the orbital bone. A dark crimson stain covered the entire left side of his visual field. The ruptured capillaries from his grueling work at the foundry had not yet healed. He ignored the pain and focused on the detailed drawings of the western dam. The ink lines of the curved concrete barrier looked fragile against the imagined weight of the ocean. The disgraced hydraulic engineer closed his eyes for a brief, quiet second. When he opened them, the dim workshop transformed into a brilliant web of light. The calculus of flow flared to life within his tired mind. Glowing blue geometric lines projected themselves directly onto the dark wooden walls. Bright vectors of force stretched across the drafting table like glowing spiderwebs. He watched the blue numbers spin and recalculate in his field of vision. The display showed the current river discharge rates dropping as the tide retreated. It was a silent, terrifying prelude to the massive storm system gathering in the north. He focused his gaze on the central keyway of the concrete dam. A floating blue cube appeared over the drawing, displaying the material stress limits. The numbers flickered rapidly, changing with every simulated wave impact. His right temple throbbed with a sudden sharp needle of agony. He gasped, his hand slipping on the smooth brass of the slide rule. The glowing blue lines wavered, distorting into jagged, chaotic patterns. He forced his mind to steady the shifting equations. The heavy wooden door of the workshop creaked open on its iron hinges. Anika stepped into the room, carrying a tray with a steaming pot of tea. The pragmatic maritime smuggler stopped in her tracks as she saw the glowing blue light. She set the tray down on a nearby crate with a soft, metallic clatter. Her dark eyes widened as she looked at the walls covered in glowing mathematical formulas. She observed the pale, hollow cheeks of the determined engineer. Hendrik did not turn his head to acknowledge her presence. His fingers continued to scribble frantic notes on a fresh sheet of parchment. The black ink ran quickly, forming neat columns of trigonometric values. Anika stepped closer, her leather boots crunching on the discarded papers. She reached out a hand, then hesitated, pulling it back to her side. She warned him that the local harbor pilots were already fleeing inland. She stated that the sea had retreated past the outer sandbars. Hendrik nodded slowly, his gaze locked on the shifting blue vectors. The Earth is preparing for the impact. He explained without looking. He pointed to a drawing of the curved concrete barrier. The Mason Guild had built their old walls to be dense and rigid. They relied on crude earth-binding magic to hold the stone blocks together. But magic could not stop the internal erosion caused by high pressure. The water would find the microfractures and tear the stone apart from within. Hendrik's curved concrete design aimed to redistribute that immense force into the bedrock. To survive, the dam had to flex and vibrate at a specific frequency. If the incoming waves matched the natural resonance of the concrete, the structure would shatter. He had to calculate the exact frequency to adjust the sluice gate openings. A blue window flickered into existence before his eyes, displaying the resonance formulas. The glowing white text listed the elasticity coefficients of the volcanic ash cement. The numbers were incredibly complex, requiring thousands of individual calculations. The strain of the mental math sent a wave of nausea through his stomach. Hendrik gripped the edge of the drafting table to keep from falling. A warm, wet drop fell from his nose, splashing onto the center of the blueprint. The red droplet smeared across a line representing the foundation pilings. He wiped his upper lip with the back of his hand, leaving a dark streak. Anika let out a sharp, quiet intake of breath as she saw the blood. She stepped forward and grabbed his shoulder with a firm grip. The smuggler demanded that he stop the calculations and rest for an hour. She argued that a dead engineer could not defend the town from the sea. Hendrik pulled away from her touch, his movements stiff and mechanical. He told her that an hour of rest would cost them the entire western delta. He stated that the concrete needed to be cured and adjusted before the storm arrived. His right eye flared with a sudden blinding flash of white light. A tiny blood vessel in the white of his eye ruptured with a silent pop. A warm trickle of blood began to seep from the corner. A heavy brass barometer vibrated against Hendrik's trembling palm. The thick glass face of the instrument cracked under the sudden massive drop in atmospheric pressure. Inside the tube, the silver column of mercury plunged down to unprecedented depths. The disgraced hydraulic engineer squinted through a hazy, red-tinted mist in his left eye. A thick layer of dried blood crusted along his lower eyelashes. He wiped the dark smear away with a damp sleeve, but the darkness remained. The sky above Westerdam turned a deep, bruised shade of charcoal. Thick, unnatural clouds bubbled downward like boiling tar. The wind died completely, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the entire delta. Hendrik stood on the high stone crest of the western dam. The massive curved concrete barrier beneath his feet felt cold and solid. He reached out his right hand to grip the heavy iron wheel of the main sluice gate. The rusted metal bit into his calloused skin. My calculations must hold against the weight of the world. He looked out toward the western harbor. The water was gone, a vast, glistening expanse. A heavy brass barometer vibrated against Hendrik's trembling palm. The thick glass face of the instrument cracked under the sudden, massive drop in atmospheric pressure. Inside the tube, the silver column of mercury plunged down to unprecedented depths. The disgraced hydraulic engineer squinted through a hazy, red-tinted mist in his left eye. A thick layer of dried blood crusted along his lower eyelashes. He wiped the dark smear away with a damp sleeve, but the darkness remained. The sky above Westerdam turned a deep, bruised shade of charcoal. Thick, unnatural clouds bubbled downward like boiling tar. The wind died completely, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence over the entire delta. Hendrik stood on the high stone crest of the western dam. The massive curved concrete barrier beneath his feet felt cold and solid. He reached out his right hand to grip the heavy iron wheel of the main sluice gate. The rusted metal bit into his calloused skin. My calculations must hold against the weight of the world. He looked out toward the western harbor. The water was gone. A vast, glistening expanse of gray mud stretched out for miles under the dark sky. Shattered crab shells and stranded fish flopped helplessly in the wet silt. The sea had retreated far past the outer sandbars, gathering its immense strength. A low, rhythmic rumble vibrated through the deep bedrock of the western delta. It was a sound felt in the soles of the feet rather than heard in the ears. Beside him, Anika Voss checked the thick hemp ropes securing the secondary winches. The pragmatic maritime smuggler wiped salty sweat from her forehead with a scarred hand. Her dark eyes scanned the empty horizon with an expression of intense vigilance. She shouted that the harbor docks had completely vanished beneath the rising foam in the distance. She warned him that the primary chains were already under immense tension. Hendrik did not turn his head to acknowledge her presence. His focus remained locked on the empty seabed. A blue geometric grid flickered into existence across the massive curved concrete wall. The glowing lines of the calculus of flow traced the internal stress vectors of the barrier. Numbers and mathematical equations shifted rapidly, reflecting the massive hydrostatic forces to come. The strain of the mental math sent a wave of nausea through his stomach. His right temple throbbed with a sudden sharp needle of agony. A warm droplet of blood fell from his nose, splashing onto the iron wheel. High on the northern cliffs, Rude Kroon watched the approaching deluge. The ruthless Grand Mason stood with his arms crossed over his heavy woolen robes. His fingers twitched with the familiar hum of earth-binding magic. He expected the concrete barrier to shatter like cheap glass upon impact. The Mason Guild had built their old walls to be dense, rigid, and unyielding. They relied on crude, earth-binding magic to hold the heavy stone blocks together. But magic could not stop the internal erosion caused by high pressure. The water would always find the microfractures and tear the stone apart from within. Hendrik's curved concrete design aimed to redistribute that immense force into the bedrock. To survive, the dam had to flex and vibrate at a specific frequency. A dark line appeared on the horizon, growing taller with every passing second. The abyssal tide approached with the speed of a galloping horse. It was a 30-foot wall of churning black water, capped with aggressive white foam. The massive wave carried the shattered remnants of fishing boats and splintered piers. The sound of the approaching water grew into a deafening metallic roar. The cold wind whipped Hendrik's hair across his face as he held his ground. He forced his mind to steady the shifting equations in his vision. The blue vectors on the concrete wall began to vibrate, matching the frequency of the earth. The water slammed into the outer nose of the dam with a thunderous impact. A massive sheet of gray spray shot 50 feet into the dark sky. The entire concrete structure groaned under the sudden, immense hydrostatic pressure. Deep within the barrier, the high-tensile iron reinforcement bars began to scream. Hendrik felt the violent vibration travel up through his boots and into his knees. His right eye flared with a sudden blinding flash of white light. A tiny blood vessel in the white of his eye ruptured with a silent pop. The blue geometric grid on his vision flared into an angry, pulsing red. The material stress limits along the central arch were rapidly approaching the breaking point. I must not let the structural resonance align with the wave. He reached for the heavy brass slide rule tucked into his leather belt. His shaking fingers adjusted the cursor, matching the velocity of the debris against the water flow. He saw a massive oak trunk, torn from the eastern forest, rushing toward the gate. The heavy timber acted as a battering ram, propelled by the kinetic energy of the wave. It aligned perfectly with the fragile support pillars of the main sluice gate. If the trunk struck the central pillar directly, the iron gate would shear away. Hendrik shouted to Anika to release the safety pawl on the eastern winch. The smuggler hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at the churning foam below. She kicked the iron lever with the heel of her heavy leather boot. The heavy iron chain rattled violently as it spun off the wooden drum. The eastern sluice gate dropped 3 inches into the rushing torrent. The sudden shift in water volume altered the local current directly in front of the dam. A powerful vortex formed, spinning the massive oak trunk away from the central pillar. The timber struck the curved concrete flank of the dam with a dull, heavy thud. The structure vibrated, but the curved design successfully redistributed the impact into the bedrock. Rude Kroon leaned over the cliff edge, his eyes widening in utter disbelief. The rigid stone walls he had built in the past would have cracked instantly under such a blow. Yet the engineer's concrete barrier remained upright, defying the weight of the sea. Hendrik gasped for breath, his chest heaving as the mental strain intensified. A severe migraine clawed at his brain, threatening to drag him into unconsciousness. He was now calculating almost entirely blind in his left eye, relying on the fading blue lines. The water level behind the dam began to rise at an alarming rate. The immense pressure forced thin jets of high-velocity spray through the microgaps in the iron seals. The cold water hissed as it struck the hot, vibrating metal of the sluice mechanism. Anika grabbed the iron wheel beside Hendrik, adding her physical strength to his. Her boots slipped on the wet concrete as she strained against the mechanical resistance. She screamed that the northern spillway was becoming choked with floating debris. A tangled mass of cargo nets and broken timbers blockaded the overflow channel. If the spillway clogged completely, the rising water would overtop the dam. An overtopping wave would erode the dry soil at the base of the structure, causing a total collapse. Hendrik focused his remaining cognitive strength on the clogged channel. The calculus of flow projected a series of glowing vectors over the tangled debris. He identified the single, critical timber holding the entire blockage in place. It was a broken mast from a smuggler's vessel, wedged tightly against the concrete tooth. He told Anika that they needed to trigger a sudden back pressure wave to clear the obstruction. He instructed her to close the western sluice gate completely for 5 seconds. The smuggler looked at him as if he had lost his mind. Closing the gate would temporarily double the hydrostatic pressure on the central arch. She warned him that the iron reinforcement bars might snap under the sudden load. Hendrik locked his gaze onto her, his face pale and smeared with dark blood. He stated that it was their only chance to clear the spillway. Anika gritted her teeth and threw her entire weight against the western control lever. The heavy iron gate slid down into its groove with a metallic shriek. The water behind the gate backed up instantly, forming a massive, swelling mound of dark liquid. The concrete wall groaned louder, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in the teeth of the crew. A sharp crack echoed through the structure as a minor concrete joint sheared. Hendrik's vision swam with brilliant mind to steady the shifting equations in his vision. The blue vectors on the concrete wall began to vibrate, matching the frequency of the earth. The water slammed into the outer nose of the dam with a thunderous impact. A massive sheet of gray spray shot 50 feet into the dark sky. The entire concrete structure groaned under the sudden, immense hydrostatic pressure. Deep within the barrier, the high-tensile iron reinforcement bars began to scream. Hendrik felt the violent vibration travel up through his boots and into his knees. His right eye flared with a sudden blinding flash of white light. A tiny blood vessel in the white of his eye ruptured with a silent pop. The blue geometric grid on his vision flared into an angry, pulsing red. The material stress limits along the central arch were rapidly approaching the breaking point. I must not let the structural resonance align with the wave. He reached for the heavy brass slide rule tucked into his leather belt. His shaking fingers adjusted the cursor, matching the velocity of the debris against the water flow. He saw massive oak foundations were marked in faint red ink near the bottom. He traced the lines with his finger, remembering the sacrifice of Martin Brand. The blind master mason had given his life to secure this data. Hendrik would not let that sacrifice be in vain. He began to draw the new canal routes, his pen moving with absolute precision. The blue vectors appeared on the map, showing him the natural flow of the underground springs. He adjusted the angles of the channels to maximize the drainage efficiency. Every line was a promise to the people of Westerdam that they would never drown again. He worked through the afternoon, ignoring the hunger clawed at his stomach. The physical degeneration of his body was a constant threat, but he could not stop. The countdown was still running in his head, a silent clock ticking toward their destruction. He knew that the High King would not ignore the loss of the municipal treasury. Willem de Graaf had been a corrupt politician, but he was still a representative of the crown. The royal court would send tax collectors and soldiers to investigate his disappearance. Hendrik held the heavy brass slide rule against the damp parchment. A single drop of black ink fell from his quill, staining the harbor map. The small workshop smelled of wet wool, sea salt, and drying paper. Outside, the morning sun reflected off the newly dried streets of Westerdam. The townspeople walked through the marketplace without fear of the tides. Hendrik rubbed his temple, where a dull ache throbbed behind his eyes. His left eye remained completely dark, a casualty of the storm calculations. He adjusted the brass cursor with his thumb, aligning the tidal measurements. The tide had retreated, but the water level remained 3 inches too high. He noted the discrepancy in his leather-bound journal. He wiped his brow with a stained sleeve, his hand shaking slightly. A blue geometric grid flickered across his remaining field of vision. The calculus of flow projected thin, glowing lines over the paper map. The vectors of hydrostatic pressure did not align with the coastal bedrock. He traced the blue lines as they curved toward the northern deeps. The mathematical grid showed a downward slope that defied all seasonal patterns. He blinked to clear his vision, but the glowing lines remained tilted. The brass slide rule slipped from his numb fingers and hit the floorboards. The metal instrument clattered against the wood, stopping near his boot. Hendrik did not reach down to retrieve it. He stared at the map, his breath catching in his dry throat. The calculations revealed a terrifying reality about the coastal shelf. The land was not merely facing a temporary surge of the tide. The entire continental shelf was actively tilting into the oceanic trench. The earth beneath our feet is sliding into the deep. He gripped the edge of the heavy oak table to steady himself. The wood felt solid, but the math proved it was slowly descending. The rate of descent was accelerating with every passing hour. He looked out the window at the massive concrete dam he had built. The Grand Barrier stood proud, keeping the North Sea at bay. Yet the dam was anchored to bedrock that was itself sinking. If the shelf continued to tilt, the ocean would eventually overtop the wall. Anika Voss entered the workshop, carrying a crate of iron bolts. Her boots clicked softly on the dry floorboards as she approached. She set the heavy wooden crate down on